Dean of the Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to welcome Gordon Brown, the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the United Kingdom. Gordon Brown is a quite remarkable man. I found that out through personal experience when I met him about a year ago, and at a meeting where I was deeply impressed by what he had to say. He was born in Glasgow in 1951, graduated with first-class honors from Edinburgh University, and then went on to lecture in politics at Edinburgh University and then Caledonian University, and then joined Scottish television in 1980 as a journalist. You may have detected by now that he is Scottish. He became a member of Parliament in 1983 and became chair of the Labour Party's Scottish Council. But perhaps most important, he was, along with Tony Blair, the man who took the Labour Party from an old Labour which was consistently losing elections to a new Labour which is in office with an unprecedented level of confidence in the polls. He has served as Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer and now, of course, is Chancellor of the Exchequer, and has the task not only of running the economy of the United Kingdom, but also of trying to think through the problems of the world's economy. And in that, he is going to address us tonight on the subject of rediscovering public purpose in the new global economy. Please join me in welcoming Gordon Brown.
Well, Professor Nye, ladies and gentlemen, can I say, first of all, that there can be no more appropriate country to discuss the challenges facing the new global economy than the United States of America, the preeminent architect of the post-war global financial system. And there can be no forum more appropriate than the Kennedy School, named after the president who, on July the 4th, more than a third of a century ago, matched the Declaration of Independence of 1776 with what he called a new declaration of economic interdependence for our time. And I think there can be no more appropriate institution to talk about the global economy than Harvard University, where 50 years ago, the Marshall Plan, the most ambitious multinational effort for economic reconstruction that the world has actually seen, was first launched. Now, more than half a century ago, leaders who were still engaged in war took the time to prepare for peace. And in a breathtaking leap into a new era, the world created not just new international institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, GATT, now the World Trade Organization, as well as the United Nations, and also a whole set of new international rules for an international economy. But the world also gave expression to a new public purpose based on high ideals. A generation of leaders who had known the greatest of depressions and the greatest of wars knew also that just as peace could not be preserved in isolation, prosperity could not be maximized in isolation either. And what they did for the day and for their generation was so dramatic that Dean Acheson spoke of that period as akin to being present at the creation. One of the signal events of that period was, of course, the Bretton Woods Conference. And I've asked myself why it was that this conference that set the new international architecture for the post-world world was held not in Washington or in New York, not even perhaps as it should have been in Massachusetts, but was held in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And in fact, as I discovered, the location was the price that the Roosevelt administration had to pay to persuade a New Hampshire senator to abandon isolationism. As Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local, even global politics. And of course, if Massachusetts and not New Hampshire had threatened isolationism, perhaps we might today have been talking not of the Bretton Woods Agreement, but of the Cambridge Agreement. Nothing could more vividly show the practical nature of those visionaries who created the new world than that they chose Bretton Woods. So anxious were they to get these new proposals through Congress. But practical as it was, Bretton Woods also defined a new public purpose characterized by high ideals. The conference was about more than exchange rates, more than about the mechanisms of financial arrangements. more than even about new institutions. As the American Secretary of the Treasury said as president of the conference at the very opening session on the opening day, he said, "Prosperity has no fixed limits. It is not a finite substance to be diminished by division. On the contrary, the more of it that other nations enjoy, the more each nation will have for itself." Prosperity, he said, like peace, is indivisible. We cannot afford to have it scattered here or there amongst the fortunate or enjoy it at the expense of others. In short, prosperity to be sustained had to be shared. Practicality and morality went hand in hand. And indeed, George Marshall reaffirmed this in his own historic speech here at Harvard. We must fight, he said, against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos, to secure, he said, the revival of a working economy in the world that would permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. So the post-war arrangements were founded on the bold belief that public action on a new and wider stage could advance a new and worldwide public purpose of high ideals rooted in social justice, to achieve prosperity for all by each cooperating with the other, new international rules of the game that involved a commitment to high levels of growth and employment, the job of every economy to create jobs for all. And the founders of Bretton Woods resolved that the failed policies of laissez-faire, which resulted in vast inequities and recurring depressions from the 1870s to the 1930s, would not be repeated. Untrammeled, unregulated market forces had brought great instability and even greater injustice. And in the post-war era, governments had to work as they concluded, collectively, if they were to achieve either justice or stability. Now, the initiatives and the institutions of that era were shaped to the conditions of the time. A world economy, as we know, of protected national markets then, limited capital flows, fixed exchange rates. And for nearly 30 years, that system worked. For hundreds of millions of people who enjoyed unparalleled prosperity, Bretton Woods took us a long way. Yet, of course, even in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people were still in poverty, and we still had a long way to go. Now, in that first historic phase of international economic management, nation-states spoke unto nation-states with an unprecedented degree of cooperation between what were separated and still largely insulated economies. The international rules of the game then largely consisted of open current accounts, fixed exchange rates, closed capital accounts, collective support when countries ran into balance of payments problems. But over the next generation, that new world, too, became old, as the existing order of nation-states and collective international action was increasingly bypassed by the growth and eventually the sheer force of international financial flows, successively ending dollar convertibility into gold, the fixed exchange rate system, post-war Keynesian certainties, and bringing in its wake an outbreak of inflation and then stagflation that spread right across the Western world. And so the 1980s saw a new consensus emerge, and it was essentially an attempt to return to laissez-faire. It focused not on what governments should do, but on what governments should not do. It emphasized private pursuits almost at the expense of public purpose. Enlightened self-interest gave way to sheer self-interest. Instead of rising to the challenges of applying the high ideals of the post-war world to a new world, instead of aiming for high levels of employment and prosperity for all as a specific policy, sights were lowered, the vision was narrowed, the new right consensus focused almost entirely on inflation and minimal government. Now, of course, it was, and it is right, to say that inflation is costly. Once out of control, it is even more costly to reverse. Macroeconomic stability based on low inflation and sound public finances is an absolute precondition of economic success in the modern world. Indeed, there is a new premium on economic stability for countries operating in the global economy. A nation-state that relies on investment flows from around the world and is also vulnerable to them now knows that the retribution for getting things wrong is swift and it is often terrible. And that new right consensus did understand the importance of liberalizing economies, from excessive regulation and from bad government. But I believe they confused means with ends and said in effect that inflation alone and not growth and employment were exclusive concerns. They said that government was bad, that government can't make a difference, at least a positive one, in jobs and growth, that global markets had to be left entirely to market dogmas, which have no place for the pursuit of the high ideals I've talked about. And this consensus failed even in its own stated purpose. The Reagan administration brought the largest fiscal deficit in American history. The Thatcher government in Britain reduced Britain to inflationary boom and bust. And of course, by 1997, an increasingly turbulent and inadequately supervised international system threatened to create boom and bust on a global scale. Now both of the Bretton Woods objectives, not only prosperity for all, but stability for all, were at risk. And the post-war hope for an indivisible prosperity was replaced by the sudden fear of an indivisible instability. The new right consensus could not endure. Now, as the downturn in Asia reverberated around the world, President Clinton said that the world faced perhaps its most serious crisis in half a century. In recent months, as interest rates have come down and the G7 group of industrialized nations have set a timetable for financial reforms, financial markets have become less unstable. But this is no time for complacency. We must recognize how far we have come in purpose as well as in time from 1945, and we must recognize how without public purpose in the new global economy, one set of events in one continent can inflict so much damage on so many people. And we must determine, as I will propose this evening, on a set of major reforms to the international financial system. This year, we have experienced events that were unthinkable 2 or 3 years ago. Free enterprise Hong Kong taking publicly owned stakes in all its private companies. Japan nationalizing its bank. Russia going into default. In America, the mounting of one of the biggest ever emergency refinancings, not for a bank, but for a hedge fund. And most damaging of all, the biggest growth economies of the last decade in East Asia suffering larger contractions in output ever than those experienced in the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, the political dimension of events such as these is, as George Marshall foresaw, equally far-reaching. In only 1 year, we have seen revolution in Indonesia, civil strife in Malaysia, the loss of authority in Russia. As unemployment rises, there has been unrest in South America, typified by the outcome of last week's Venezuelan elections. And I can just tell you some of my experiences coming in as a finance minister only 18 months ago, almost just as some of these events started to happen. It was quite an interesting experience for me. At the first meeting of the G8 finance ministers, only 7 of the 8 turned up because 1 had already gone. At the next meeting, the G8 ministers, only 6 of the original 8 were there. By the third meeting, there were only 5. Then 5 became 4. And now there are only 3 of the original G8 finance ministers from 18 months ago. I was in Asia, in Bangkok, only a year ago, and I think only 1 of the dozen finance ministers in Asia that I met at that time has actually survived over the year as a political force. And it reminds us of what people say about finance ministers, that there are only 2 kinds of finance ministers, those who fail and those who get out just in time. I think that of the last Asian finance minister to go, it was said that he had lost the art of communication, but not, alas, the gift of speech. And I know that another of my colleagues was finished when I heard him explaining his devaluation, and he said something like, past policies have led us to the edge of an abyss, and now is the time for a bold step forward. When I arrived at the Treasury, someone told me of a previous finance minister, and he explained to me that when he had taken office, he'd been given 3 envelopes of advice from his predecessor. And he was told that as things got bad and then moved to worse, he might benefit from the advice in each of them, and he might open one at a time as things degenerated. And so when things started to go bad, as they do, as I found out actually rather quickly, he opened, in this case, a previous finance minister, he opened the first envelope to get his advice. And the first envelope gave him his advice then, and it said, "Blame your predecessor," which of course came in very handy for me. And then, of course, the opinion polls go up a bit, and then they go down, and then you're looking for further advice, and my predecessor turned to the envelope given by a previous finance minister. And the second piece of advice was, blame your colleagues. And of course, a bit of that happens as well, as you know, in politics. And then things degenerated again, and finally, in absolute desperation, the finance minister looked at the third envelope and finally decided to open it to get his advice. And he read the advice there. Start writing 3 envelopes to your successor. Now, things have gone a long way since one of my predecessors as finance minister, only 50 years ago. Whenever a cabinet meeting coincided with a race meeting, he always chose the race meeting. Now, as far as events over the last year are concerned, these major political convulsions, and of course, at the end of the day, the ultimate price of all this is profound human suffering. In Korea, unemployment has actually trebled in 1 year. In Indonesia, 10 years of growth have been wiped out. In the Asian crisis countries as a whole, the number of people in poverty is set to double by 2000. And we can't simply declare that whenever the stock market bounces back, that the crisis is over and we can return to the status quo. We must act, therefore, not only because it's in our self-interest to safeguard our own prospects and prosperity, but because it is morally right to do so. So I believe that the responsibility now falls on this generation to be present at a new creation of new rules that break with the past and both effectively and fairly meet the demands of the new global economy. I believe we must reject the false choice between clinging to laissez-faire and retreating to some 1930s protectionism or the tightly controlled restricted capital markets of the 40s. We must meet the new challenge, but we must remember that while time and circumstances change, ideals endure. And I believe our aim must be an international financial system for the 21st century that recognizes the new realities: open, not sheltered economies, international, not national capital markets, global, not local competition. And it must be one that captures the full benefits of global markets and capital flows, that minimizes the risks of disruption, maximizes opportunity for all, and lifts up the most vulnerable. In short, the restoration for the international economy of public purpose and high ideals. Now, our predecessors did that for the post-war national economies as they drew closer together. We must now do it for the post-national economy where economically no nation is an island. And the consensus of the 1980s, with its narrow focus on inflation, on privatization and deregulation, must evolve into a new 90s consensus with a broader emphasis on competition, on supervision, and on the right conditions for growth and employment around the world. And before I describe the specific reforms we need, let me be clear that this new public purpose will require public endeavor. In the international economy, the era of absentee government is over. We need that middle way between government doing everything and government doing nothing. One of my predecessors as a Scottish Member of Parliament called in the 1920s for a third alternative between unacceptable state power and unbridled market forces. It was here in your country that Franklin Roosevelt in the 30s found a third way for the national economy, securing the benefits of markets while taming their excesses. And I believe that the third way, initiated and developed by Tony Blair, has profound relevance for the challenges we now confront on the global stage. The issue is not one of either markets or governments, but how markets and governments can best work together. And the way forward for the global economy is not to retreat from globalization into either protectionism or old national controls, or to retreat into a failed laissez-faire. It is to ensure that global markets can work in the public interest. And, for example, transparency in policymaking will be one way that we will develop the educated and informed markets that we need. In a world where the new frontier is no frontiers, we must rediscover that public purpose and the high ideals of 1945 with 4 major reforms that add up to a transformation in the international financial system, a new constitution, an economic constitution for the global economy. Now, the first change is internationally agreed codes of conduct for transparency and for proper procedures that ensure educated markets. These codes of conduct would cover monetary policy, financial and fiscal policy, and corporate governance, and they would be applied by all countries, rich and poor, as a condition for participation in the international financial system. Now, recall that the first constitutional settlement for the world economy in 1945 was not simply about institutions, it was about rules of the game, and we must return the international system to this idea of rules of the game. While the founders of Bretton Woods devised rules for a world of limited capital flows, we must devise new rules for a world of global capital flows. But our guiding star remains the same, the promotion of global economic stability and international cooperation to promote growth and employment. The codes I suggest will require accurate reporting to the international community by each national economy of all relevant economic information, the size of budget deficits, for example, the state of bank reserves, the levels of currency liabilities. And the codes will require not only this flow of information, but the adherence to specific timetables and proper standards for transparency and for disclosure. The new disciplines would involve both public and private sectors, because we need also new standards of corporate governance, including an international standard of best practice for financial institutions and for the regulators. Now, we used to think that all that industrializing countries required was raw materials, good communications, a supply of labor, the funds and the ability to tap commercial inventions. But we now know that all nations also require a sound, robust financial system. In Asia, over the last few months, we've seen in 3 countries alone 100 banks and finance houses go under. And non-performing loans in these countries are the equivalent of 1/3 of their GDP. The international community cannot condone national systems that are reckless, disordered, and dishonest. Lack of transparency anywhere can create lack of credibility everywhere. And by requiring exposure of deteriorating conditions, the codes of conduct we propose would prevent the temptation for countries to deliberately mask the problems, which is what happened in Thailand, what happened in Korea, with consequences felt across Asia and the world. And we should not be so complacent as to assume that codes of conduct are needed only in other countries and not our own, given that the most recent threat to global stability came from lack of transparency of hedge funds in the United States and Britain. We need tougher standards and requirements for disclosure all round. Now, the codes that I propose will mean radical changes in the way governments and financial markets operate. These new rules of the game are not incidental to the financial architecture for the new global economy. They are the financial architecture for the new global economy. They require countries to pursue self-discipline with the prospect, if they do not, of imposed discipline. So the right to participate fully in the international financial system should be conditional on meeting explicit responsibilities. And in this way, the codes will reduce the risk of future failures, and if failures do occur, a stronger financial system will be able to better deal with them. These codes of conduct are as relevant for underdeveloped Africa as they are for industrializing Asia and Latin America and industrialized America and Europe. They help us to lay down a route map for sequencing capital account liberalization by making sure that economic facts can't be manipulated and underlying problems cannot be hidden. Citizens will know their own country's real problems and prospects. The codes will deter corruption, particularly in the mismanagement of public finances. They will restore public confidence and support for sometimes painful reforms that are essential to long-term growth and prosperity, and they will be critical for investor confidence in the wake of the Asian crisis. Without transparency and the proper procedures that codes of conduct will require, investors may not reinvest on the long-term scale that is necessary for jobs, growth, and social progress. and national governments should not be able to pick and mix which standards they choose to meet and which standards they choose to ignore. Proper implementation, therefore, of these codes should be a condition of International Monetary Fund and World Bank support. In the global economy, national governments have rights, but they also have responsibilities that they must meet. Now, because today's financial markets are global, we need not only proper national supervision, but we also need a second fundamental reform, and that is global financial regulation. That's why Britain has proposed bringing together the IMF, the World Bank, and the key regulatory authorities in a new permanent standing committee for global financial regulation, charged with delivering the objective of a stable financial system. Now, the G7 countries have now agreed on the urgent need for this kind of coordination, and we are grateful to the President of the Bundesbank, Hans Tietmeyer, who has undertaken the critical task of preparing detailed recommendations. And I see this standing committee not as an additional institution, but as a process of monitoring developments in global finance, ensuring that the necessary worldwide standards are put in place, and providing timely surveillance of financial conditions and international capital flows. And the Standing Committee's work would make cooperation between international institutions and national regulators a fact of international economic life. In short, this Standing Committee would be the world's early warning system for regional and global economic risk. Now, our aim must be crisis prevention where possible and crisis resolution where necessary. So in place of the old approach, where intervention did not occur and has not occurred until the crisis actually hits individual countries in the world system, we need, thirdly, a modern mechanism that is rooted in transparency and proper surveillance and built on private and public sectors both accepting responsibility, but a mechanism which can identify potential problems at a stage where preventative action can be effective. Now, the mechanism they agreed in 1945 for crisis prevention dealt with imbalances in current account flows in a world of restricted capital flows and fixed exchange rates. And so to tackle public sector deficits and balance of payments crises, it offered temporary financial support or permanent exchange rate adjustment. Now, the new mechanism for crisis prevention must deal with a completely different situation, imbalances as a result of global capital flows. And it must create a framework which maximizes long-term private investment commitment, particularly in developing countries, and minimizes the risk of the rush to the door the minute a problem occurs. And this new mechanism, in my view, starts with a process of active and transparent surveillance that is a matter of course for all countries, operating in normal times at all times, not one triggered only by the warning signs or the onset of a crisis in a particular region or country. And all main participants, public and private sectors, must accept the responsibilities. So emerging market economies in particular must not only be transparent in the way they do things, they must also, in my view, forge regular contacts and lasting relationships with their private investors. An open and honest dialogue in which investors can ask hard questions and can advise will make it more difficult for countries to cover up bad news, make it easier to assess what policies will increase or reduce market confidence, and will make it more likely that we can prevent today's problems from deepening into tomorrow's crises. Now, the shorthand phrase for these creditor-to-country arrangements has been country clubs, but these are not exclusive clubs, old boys networks, informal means of defending privilege. What we are proposing are modern investor networks that can bring real benefits in return for real responsibilities, networks, investor networks that every country should form and every creditor should join. And to make these work, there should be a new presumption across the board in favour of the release of information wherever possible. The G7 countries have proposed greater openness from the World Bank, the IMF, and other institutions. Their monitoring of individual countries tells us much of what is happening in national economies. Clearly, in exceptional cases, some policy discussions between them and the countries will have to be kept confidential. But I strongly support the publication of the IMF's country surveillance reports under Article 4. The case for an exception must be made and justified. Openness should be the norm. Put simply, we should establish an international right to know that is not occasional or voluntary, but ongoing and mandatory. And this will work best if the IMF and other international institutions are more open about themselves. They should do more to explain their practices and procedures to the public, and they should join in a new partnership with the private sector with ongoing discussions on a regular basis about broader and systemic issues facing the world economy. Now, with this right to a greater flow of information comes greater private sector responsibility. I believe we need a new system of debtor-creditor agreements that are crisis resolution procedures signed up to in normal times with private sector responsibility clauses, such as agreements on collective representation and majority voting when creditor decisions are being made. So when trouble hits an economy, the private sector must be prepared to do more than simply pull money out and accelerate panic. On an ad hoc basis, investors actually did the opposite in Korea and Brazil, and their decisions were essential in halting the flight of capital. Now, with these three changes, transparency, enhanced surveillance, and investor networks backed up by private sector responsibility clauses, we can establish a markedly lower threshold for effective response than the old ad hoc crisis-triggered system, and we can genuinely prevent crises caused by contagion crippling countries who are pursuing good, sound policies. I believe that detailed discussion should now take place on the right mechanisms for private sector involvement in crisis containment. Of course, more information to the private sector and more participation must not become the license for reckless investment or insider dealing. Instead, by universalizing reliable information and creating orderly consultation procedures open to all, we should be able to minimize the risks arising from insider information on the one hand and moral hazard on the other. And in this new framework that encourages long-term commitment, it should be the duty of the public sector to inform and to make the reforms as national governments that are necessary. It should be the responsibility of the international financial institutions to monitor and to publish, and it should be the responsibility of the private sector to engage and to take its share of responsibility. And because of these new disciplines for crisis containment that we propose, the public sector internationally can now justify a system of mutual financial support, which is assistance to countries pursuing sound policies and to contain the spread of financial contagion. In the last few weeks, the international community has proposed a temporary precautionary facility with short-term lines of credit for sound economies that are the victim of contagion. Once transparency, surveillance, and agreed private sector responsibility clauses are embedded in a new system, this facility should, in my view, be made permanent, and it should be properly funded. Now, of course, countries that do not follow these sound policies or act on advice cannot expect that they and their private sectors will secure crisis support. The real moral hazard here would be to guarantee such support independent of whether they do the right things. But with the reforms that we are proposing, I believe we have a real opportunity to move the emphasis of international financial governance from one of crisis response, simply crisis response, to one of crisis prevention and crisis containment. Now, there is a fourth and final reform. We propose a code of global best practice for social policy, which will apply to every country, will set minimum standards, and will ensure that when the IMF and World Bank help a country in trouble, the agreed programs of reform will actually preserve investment in the social, education, and employment programs that are essential, particularly to developing countries' growth. This should be an indispensable goal for government in the new global economy. It is not government guaranteeing that nothing will change, and it is not government leaving everything to pure market forces. It is government equipping people to turn change into new opportunities. I think we all know that international economics is not just about numbers in a ledger, it is about the lives of people. And for too long, it has been assumed in every crisis that the cost of crisis will inevitably be paid by putting more burdens on the poor, by cutting health or education and basic social services. Now, this is wrong in the short term, and it will not work in the long term, because it erodes both the economic and political foundations of a society. For reasons of self-interest as well as conscience, I do not believe we can accept a worldwide regime of the well-off in the castle and the vast majority left at the gate. And creating national support for needed reform depends on sharing gains and helping those who are hurt by economic crisis. As Jim Wolfensohn, President of the World Bank, has put it, social and economic issues here are inseparable. They are like breathing in and breathing out. Now, in their October statement, the G7 ministers recognized for the first time the urgent need for a code of good social practice that would apply to all countries. It asked the World Bank to work with countries and the United Nations and others to develop the principles and provisions of such a code. This is, in my view, a historic opportunity to realize the enduring public purpose and high ideals of 1944. And we should not see this code in narrow terms as merely creating social safety nets. We should see it as the chance to create opportunities for all by investing more, not less, in education, employment, and vital public services in the countries that we are talking about. So the way forward is not leaving people defenseless and tolerating a culture of poverty, not repeating past mistakes which have created a culture of dependency. It is equipping people to cope with change through a new culture of opportunity. And the first building block of that set of principles for social policy must be minimal social provisions such as safe water supplies, universally available vaccinations, basic health care, in every society, universal access to schooling for girls as well as boys. The second building block must be the chance to work and the assurance that work will pay, a commitment that we must stage by stage, year by year, fulfill in developing countries as well as developed ones. And the code should set out the best practice that can help people find and remain in paid employment, help people move from poverty or welfare to work, offer lifetime learning so that people can move themselves up a ladder of opportunity, and look to create pension systems and social security systems that mean a lifetime of work will be followed by a decent retirement. And we should be forging new partnerships between the public and private sectors and the NGOs to be able to do this. Now, of course, the existence of any particular program today should never be the excuse for its perpetuation tomorrow. And of course, also, the reforms that the IMF and other international authorities require must be consistent with the social principles and make a virtue of preserving social investment. And for the poorest, highly indebted countries of the world, we must now create a virtuous circle of debt relief, poverty reduction, and economic development. We should never leave countries with an impossible choice between paying or defaulting on unsustainable levels of debt. Immovable mountains of debt that were run up in the 1980s have become impassable barriers to progress for poor countries in the 90s. And it should now be our ambition that every highly indebted poor country is in the process of debt relief by the millennium. And for countries like hurricane-hit Nicaragua and Honduras, weighed down by the burden of debt and devastation, it was and is our aim to create a new World Bank Trust Fund with over $130 million pledged already to alleviate the debt payments to international organizations. But it is also right to go further, to devise a new post-disaster facility that will give emergency relief from debt to all countries in this position. I believe that 1999 must bring a new urgency to the resolution of the problems of debt relief round the world. What we must therefore do together is create a new economic constitution for the global economy. It must be born out of new realities. It must be grounded in new rights and responsibilities. It should be enshrined in codes of conduct that are agreed nationally and applied internationally. And in doing so, we should rediscover public purpose in the international economy and bring to life again the high ideals of 1945. I believe we need to move quickly and not debate indefinitely. Agreement on codes of conduct should be reached, as we will propose at the IMF meetings in April. The new system of global financial regulation should be in place by next summer. The new mechanism for crisis prevention and crisis resolution should be agreed in principle in the summer, and the details should be the subject of intensive discussions between the private sector and national and international institutions to reach agreement by the end of 1999. And the Code for Best Practice in Social Policy should be agreed at World Bank meetings in the spring of next year. This is, in my view, a programme of reform for our generation. It is more than simply a collection of 4 proposals, because it rests on a modern vision of government doing the right thing, but not everything, of markets working, but not always perfectly, of principles of economic and social justice that reflect our best values and ultimately determine world stability and growth. The project is therefore indivisible. Each element is essential to the success of the whole, and all of it is built on the understanding that increasingly we are all part of both one global economy and one moral universe, an economy there to serve the people, not the people there to serve the economy. Ours is an age of great challenges, and it is also an age of great possibilities. What Franklin Roosevelt said to the citizens of this nation in 1933 is now powerfully relevant to the citizens and government of all nations. He said then, "If I read the temper of our people correctly, we now realize, as we have never realized before, our interdependence on each other, that we must be willing to sacrifice for the good of a common discipline, because without such discipline, no progress is made." Today, I believe that we in our generation do have the vision, the values, and the will, as the generation which preceded us, to make the world economy anew. I believe we have the public purpose and will demonstrate the public purpose and high ideals to make a better world economy in every sense of that word. Thank you.
Thank you for a very thoughtful speech. We now have time for a few questions. There are microphones on this side and that side, and we'll take them alternately. And I'd like to ask you to please identify yourself before you place your question. So go first to the microphone.
I'm Jonathan Richmond. I'm a fellow at the Kennedy School of Government. Chancellor, that was a wonderful speech, and I'm quite prepared to accept your personal integrity and say that this is a wonderful indication to hear this talk of morality. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that it may not reflect overall British government policy. I note in particular Prime Minister Blair's recent visit to China, the emphasis of which appeared to be doing business for Britain, making money for Britain, in which he didn't take the opportunities one would have hoped for to try and protest at the behavior of China, not only within its own country, but in Tibet, which it has invaded. Chancellor, I recently visited Tibet and was appalled by the oppression I saw there. Does this not matter to the British government when it means perhaps giving up some economic gains for Britain in the short term?
Well, it does matter to the British government, and I think if you look at what Tony Blair said both before his visit and during his visit, he made it clear the government's position, as this government has made its position clear on human rights in China. And I take the points you make about Tibet, and we'll pass them on. I think it is very important to recognize that what we are proposing is a relationship between individual liberty, social justice, and economic progress. And I do not think that it is fair to suggest that Tony Blair sees that any differently from me. I also believe that one of the lessons that we have learned from the Asian crisis, and I think one of the lessons that will actually inform all the discussions that will take place about the future of these economies over years to come, is the importance of the social underpinning, indeed the democratic and political underpinning of these economies for future economic success. And what has interested me over recent years is how there has been a coming together of both writings, if I may say so, from the left of centre and right of centre about these issues, that there is a recognition that for there to be economic success in future years, there will have to be trust between sections of the population. For that trust to exist, the minute an economy becomes more than simply an economy made up of the activities of different families, for that trust to exist, there must be individual opportunity backed up by democratic rights. Now, obviously, you have a particular view on Tibet and China, but I do say that the relationship between individual liberty, social justice, and economic progress is something that is absolutely crucial to the development of every economy, including our own. And it is not something that Tony Blair would miss if he were speaking to you this evening.
Yes, my name is Dr. Michael Charney. In 1995 at Halifax, the G7 forgoed, or whatever, did not choose to introduce or discuss a Tobin tax or some method to regulate global capital flows. And I think an opportunity was lost to address those issues in advance, and now we're dealing with the aftermath. There's another large global problem that actually is in tandem with our economic instability, and that's environmental instability. And in your speech, you didn't mention specifically the environment, though you did refer to disasters and sustainable economies and so forth. But if we're really going to solve a large problem, I think we could probably take the two problems and find a common solution to some extent, which is in you're developing a world economic, a new Bretton Woods for the future, that we introduce the Tobin tax, we use those funds to implement north-south transfer of technology so that we can clean up our global energy system that threatens, through fossil fuel, carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, to destroy stability on a very vast scale over the next 100 years.
Well, I agree with what you say about the environment. It has been the subject of the discussions that arose from Kyoto. Every continent is now having to look at how it applies these targets that have been set, and I do say that that Europe is now having to come to terms with some major changes in environmental policy in relation to industrial energy taxation, for example, and in relation to the general use of energy. And I believe that that will be true throughout the world. So I do not underestimate the importance of the changes that have come out of Kyoto and the need to do more in future years. And we must not place the burden of responding to environmental pressures on the poorest countries. We must all accept our responsibility to deal with these issues. As far as the speculators tax is concerned, this is an issue that obviously coming into government and even before any person in the finance ministry would want to look at. The speculation tax that has been proposed by Professor Tobin, of course, many other proposals that have come, George Soros more recently for a global insurance corporation, and many other suggestions that have been appearing in academic and other literature recently. But I do say that the problems of implementing a speculation tax are immense. The problems of finding a means by which it can be charged in every area, the problems of getting international agreement to do so are perhaps small in relation to the problems of administering a tax if you were to implement it. And I personally believe, and I hope that the speech I made this evening, I personally believe that whether it is the Tobin proposal or the Soros proposal, the starting point of each of them is the need for proper disclosure and the need for informed and educated markets. Indeed, you cannot have the Tobin speculation tax or the Soros Insurance Corporation unless you have the degree of transparency that I've been talking about this evening. And my own view is that to introduce both transparency and procedures that require ordinariness in the management of monetary, fiscal, and financial policies generally is a far more radical change than most people who have been commenting on this recently have suggested. I go to all these meetings and I hear people say, well, transparency fine, disclosure fine, standards fine, now let's get on to the real issue. And nobody has actually solved or brought to a conclusion the discussions and the policy recommendations on these first things. And I do say that if countries were forced to disclose information, as they never did in relation to some of the problems that we saw in Asia, then it would never have been the case that the problems that we saw last Christmas could have developed to the stage they did, developing from a drama really into a huge crisis because that transparency would have forced out into the public arena information that would have forced also international creditors and others to require action to be taken by these governments. And whether it is dealing with the problems of corruption in some economies where the improper or the failure to disclose public financial positions, or whether dealing with the borrowings of central banks or the lack of reserves of central banks, the changes that we're proposing to create transparency actually will do more, in my view, than perhaps even a speculation tax could be able to achieve if we were able to implement it. But please do not underestimate the problems in a global economy, as we are finding as we're trying to deal with the operation of hedge funds. Please do not underestimate the problems in a global economy of implementing a speculator's tax that would have to apply to all countries and all areas without exception. Otherwise, it would not work.
The balcony?
I'm Lee Hampton, a sophomore at Harvard College, and I hope you don't mind a more political question. Despite, or maybe because of, the success of the referendum in Scotland to establish a parliament, it seems like the opinion polls have been indicating an increase in support of Scottish nationalism. I'm kind of curious why you think that has happened, what do you think is going to happen in the future, and what you and the Labour Party are going to do about it.
Well, of course, patriotism for good reasons is an honourable emotion, but the nationalism that we are seeing in many parts of the world is clearly a reaction to the pressures of change that impinge upon many economies as a result of uneven development and a result of global trends that they are facing. And it is understandable that in some countries the reaction to new economic pressures is to seek to retreat into an old world of nation states. I myself believe that whether it is Scotland or whether it is some of the other countries where we've seen nationalist uprisings recently in terms of political support for nationalist parties, I actually believe that most people in these countries realize increasingly that they're part of a global economy, that the solutions require government acting not just locally or regionally or in that national area, but internationally as well. And I don't believe myself that opinion in Scotland or in Wales or in some of the other countries that are mentioned when we talk about the rise of political nationalism in Western Europe, I don't believe that people in the countries that we're talking about want to separate from the, in this case, the United Kingdom. And I think you'll find that when election results, real election results come, that will be what actually happens.
The other side of the balcony.
My name is James Williamson. You may have fallen short on Tibet, but I'd like to take this opportunity to thank your government for the magnificent job I think you've done so far on the human rights violations committed by and under the authority of General Augusto Pinochet in Chile. So I just want to say thank you.
On the left microphone.
Yes, Kate Hampton, I'm a student here. I'm also a member of the Labour Party. I'd like to ask, given your statement of intent on environmental taxation in the first budget and recent work by IPPR and CERA that requires moving the tax burden away from labour onto resource use and pollution, I'd like to know what political obstacles remain to further greening of the Treasury, with particular reference to the introduction of an industrial energy tax following the outcome of Marshall's report on that subject.
Well, thank you very much for both being a member of the Labour Party and for acknowledging some of the things that we've been trying to do on the environment. We are consulting at the moment on an industrial energy tax. That would be a tax paid by industrial companies using particular kinds of energy. It would be a radical innovation, of course, if that were implemented for Britain. And what we did was we set up a committee, which was chaired actually by the president of the CBI, to look at these issues. He reported that while there was a case for internationally traded permits that he felt should be explored further, and no doubt this is going to happen in other countries as well, that there was also a case that now had to be looked at in detail for an industrial energy tax. And we are now consulting on the method by which that might be introduced and how far in doing so we would be achieving the Kyoto targets. I do believe that right across Europe we are seeing quite big changes at the moment in attitudes to environment and environmental taxation. The new German government, as many people will know, is pledged to radical changes in the way that it deals with environmental issues. I believe that there is considerable support now growing in the European Union as a whole for a new approach to environmental issues, and particularly in relation to environmental tax. And I hope that that means that we are all going to take seriously in Europe the application of the Kyoto targets. As a Labour government in Britain, we are actually committed to going beyond the Kyoto targets by 2010, and we have set ourselves our own targets that are actually more ambitious than the targets that Kyoto would impose upon us. But I do agree with you that whereas in the past we might have talked simply about issues of social justice and economic efficiency, we should talk about issues of social justice, environmental care and economic efficiency, recognizing that there are many developments in environmental policy that we can make that can actually add to the efficiency of the economy, as well as produce a proper distribution of a proper way of looking at the use of energy around the world.
Simon Saunders, University of Oxford. I just would like to ask the question as to why you have any confidence, Chancellor, that the proposals that you are making will in fact prove acceptable to your opposite numbers in other countries, even in the European Union, for example. Let's take the proposal to combine the World Bank and the IMF. The IMF did come under quite a lot of criticism for its recent strategy with the Asian crisis. Surely a combined institute may also make errors of judgment. May I ask, is it that your envisaged new order, economic order, is one grounded on morality rather than on, say, economic theory? That might be a defensible view. Or is it rather that you suppose there has accumulated, if you like, a store of economic wisdom in macroeconomic management, where there is indeed sufficient consensus to really float this thing on an international level? So just questions there as to the kind of basis for a consent on your proposals.
Well, it seems to me, first of all, that the very things that individual national economies had to do themselves in the post-45 era, create their own systems of supervision and regulation and transparency and so on, are exactly what we have now got to do for the global economy. I don't think we're doing something or suggesting something that is impossible. It is something that other individual countries have had to do, and we must now do as an international community for the global economy. If financial institutions are run not simply at a national level but at a global level, then the politics of the international community must respond to that. Why am I confident that we can win support for some of the propositions that I've been putting forward? I think that over the last year there has been a growing recognition that if we do not act, then there will be a repetition of the banking and financial crisis that we've seen over the last 20 years as a result of our inability to respond to the growth of global financial flows. I think it's true to say that over the last 20 years there's been around 70 banking and financial crises, some of which have been in the developed world, many of which have been as the result of inadequately supervised institutions in industrializing and emerging market economies. Now, why am I confident? Because there has been already a recognition. The IMF Interim Committee report of October, the World Bank Development Committee announcements of October as well, the G7 statement by finance ministers and central governments on October the 30th, the European Union repeating the same demands and the same proposals in a statement that they made only last week. So there is a growing support amongst the countries that can actually make a difference to the process of change that these proposals must be made. Take global financial regulation. There is now an agreement that not only Hans Tietmeyer will prepare a report for February on this, but there is now more or less agreement on the road that we must now go down in that area. Take codes of conduct requiring transparency in fiscal and monetary policy. On the fiscal policy side, the IMF has already drawn up a fiscal code that will be put to future meetings. On monetary policy, there is agreement that that must now be done. On corporate behaviour, the OECD is now drawing up a code of conduct for that. And as far as social policy is concerned, I know that the World Bank itself, partly through the instigation of Jim Wolfensohn himself, is working on drawing up these proposals at the moment. On crisis prevention and crisis resolution, the other set of proposals that I suggested demanded an urgency in responding to problems that we now have and have got to deal with. Only last month, the G7 group of countries agreed to create this new precautionary facility in the IMF. There is now debate about how that can be made from temporary into permanent, and there is also obviously the debate about crisis resolution procedures. Only last week in London, we held a meeting of the private sector with myself, Hans Tietmeyer, and Eddie George, the Governor of the Bank of England, to look at how we could actually have a staged set of proposals for dealing with crisis prevention and dealing with crisis resolution. And I think there is now considerable understanding in the international financial community, as well as amongst national governments, that we must act in this area as well. In other words, what has happened in Asia in particular, but of course what has reverberated around the world and happened in Russia as well, has made us realize that if we do not take action now, then we will be unprepared for future difficulties and future potential crises. And I now believe that there is sufficient will in the international community to take action. Obviously, on specific detail and on some of the proposals that I put forward, a great deal more work has got to be done. But I do believe we are within an ace of being able next year to say that major reforms in the international financial community have been reached. On the IMF and World Bank, you mentioned, do they work together? Of course, it is strange that the IMF is responsible for surveillance of financial systems. The World Bank is responsible for structural reform of financial systems. The Bank of International Settlement, all the institutions at Basel are responsible for the codes of principle, or the principles that govern banking and financial supervision. And so you have three separate institutions responsible for different elements of financial supervision. Now, these must be brought together in a sensible way, and that is why the proposal for a global financial process of regulation is now being pushed forward. So I believe that the issue you raised about the IMF and World Bank working together will be dealt with by these proposals. So I hope that by the end of next year, with all the measures that I've talked about, we can actually see quite fundamental reform in the international financial system, and I believe there is now political support for that to happen.
We have a question about. I'm Targo Peterson. I'm a mid-career student here. Sir, you have definitely opened a debate of historical dimensions, and you have very, very high ambitions with your time frame. I was wondering if you can see a problem in the governments and financial institutions discussing these things, but many people, the people that you care for, not being able to understand what is going on. From your inside position, you can see many more details of this, and you can also see options of what to do. I think what you've drawn up is very impressive, but I was wondering if you might see any usefulness in perhaps opening, let's say, an internet site where you can have a conference that almost anybody can drop into and make comments on this, so you can sort of poll the global opinion. And if you might see any perspectives in combining that with perhaps another, it could be Bretton Woods or another conference, perhaps even at this school, that could take up the, let's say, democratic dimension of what you're talking about, which could seem alienating, I think, to many people in the world.
Well, thank you for your suggestion about the internet site. When I can work the internet myself, I might be able to put some information onto it. But I think it is a good idea that we increase information to people about what is actually being done, that we do have consultations that are far more widespread than simply politicians. I mean, I think it's true to say that much of the discussion about the international financial institutions is for many people extremely boring. Obviously, you're talking about institutions, institutional arrangements. You seem always to be talking about the fine detail and not about the purpose of what you are trying to achieve. The one thing I do say is that we are not proposing in these reforms to create new institutions. We are not proposing to try and create elaborate new institutional frameworks that, in my view, would be a diversion from the real argument about what needs to be done. What we are trying to do is to evolve existing institutions into doing the jobs that need to be done. I actually think what happened in the 70s and 80s is that, and the early 90s, is that people lost faith in our ability to make these changes. I don't think people in the late 80s or early 90s did not see the need for some of these changes to be made. They lost faith in our ability to come together as an international community to make these changes. And I hope that we are beginning to restore people's faith that through international action we can make a difference. That, after all, was what happened in 1945, and that is what, in my view, should happen now. But as far as the public being involved in these debates, we must indeed do more. And for me, the whole set of issues comes alive when I go to, as I did, to Indonesia and saw the extreme poverty that this crisis has created for thousands, indeed it must be millions of children. And when you go to Korea and see the breakdown in established relationships and people who had never thought that unemployment was going to be a major feature of the community was now hitting them. And you go to Thailand and see the poverty on the streets. Now you can go around any of these Asian countries and see what is happening. And we must bring people to an appreciation that the human costs of these so-called adjustments, the human costs cannot be tolerated, and we do have an immediate duty to act. And that is as true of Africa, where our failure to act over half a century to deal with poverty and debt in Africa is something that must be rectified and must be one of our resolutions for the millennium.
We have one more question.
Thanks, Chair. Pippa Norris at the Kennedy School, and somebody else, by the way, who's also taught at Edinburgh University. My question follows up on the issue of basically whether there's the political will. I think, Chancellor, everybody admires the moral imperative of your argument and thinks that the proposals you put forward are very important. The real question for me is, do you think it's going to be viable, particularly in the terms of American involvement? The elite is clearly distracted by too many other things right now. The public is just not concerned. For them, the Asian crisis is not affecting jobs back home. We're not in 1945. It's not a crisis which is seen to actually affect the United States. Without American support and energy going into these proposals, do you think that they are politically viable?
Well, first of all, can I say about the involvement of the United States government that it was Robert Rubin and Larry Summers who led the way in setting up the G22 working parties, which looked at many of these issues that we're talking about this evening. And that was at the behest of the United States and the Treasury Department. And it was President Clinton himself who led the discussions at the G22 meeting only 2 months ago and pointed the way to a number of the reforms that are now being discussed both in the G7 and by the IMF and the World Bank at the moment. So I would say that the American involvement in these discussions and in proposing reforms has been outstanding, and I would not like it to be thought that either the administration has been diverted from taking up these issues or that it has been a reluctant partner in these discussions. In almost all these areas, the American administration has been leading and taking a prominent role in suggesting what should be done. You ask, is there the political will to do these things? I think there will be the political will, not simply because this is an issue of morality, as people have been saying in the discussion, but because this is a matter of economic necessity. If a breakdown in the financial system in Korea or in Russia can cause or threaten or put at risk the possibility of a credit crunch in the United States, then it does actually affect us all. It is not simply that people's sense of dignity is hurt by seeing poverty around the world and people are outraged by it. It is actually that livelihoods will be affected in advanced industrial countries if we do not find solutions that understand that the economies of modern nation states are interdependent on each other. And I believe that the proposals that we have put forward and the proposals that are actually being worked upon at the moment are proposals that every country, as a part of its enlightened self-interest, should be able to support. And as I say, you ask why some of these things have not been done 10 years ago or 20 years ago when we knew we were moving into a global financial system. I think it is because we lost faith in our belief to make these changes, and I think it is to the American administration's credit that one of the reasons why people are regaining faith in our ability collectively to make these changes, it is because governments like the American government are taking the lead.
There are still more questions, but we've run out of time. I apologize to those who cannot ask a question, but please join me in thanking Chancellor Brown for a splendid presentation this evening.